I'm live. Yeah. I think I'm live. I think this is working. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this second chat on a Monday evening. I hope the technology's worked at your end. I'm amazed that it seems to have worked this end. It's all a bit of a steep learning curve for me, but we seem to be there, which is great. The other thing I thought of today is it would be really good to have a warm-up act. And I hope to persuade my two children to come and do a dance. But unfortunately, I don't think there's much chance of that happening. So I'm afraid it's just me today. There are two topics I'm going to talk about today. The second of which is a bit crazy, a bit mad, a bit nuts. It's the sort of thing that interests me. You may just think it's completely bonkers, but as you know, I don't get out very much at the best of times, and I certainly don't at the moment. So to give you some ideas that I've been having in my stupid mind, that'll be the second topic, a sort of more light-hearted one for the second half of this talk. So more of that later. To begin with, I wanted to talk about another composer and another piece which I want to introduce to you. Some of you may have seen the talk I did last week about Vaughan Williams and the Serenade to Music, which was written in 1938. Today, I want to talk about a piece that was written a little bit earlier in 1927 and written by Lambert. And it's his wonderful cantata, the Rio Grande. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but just in case you're not, it's again one of my all-time favorite pieces and one which I would love to introduce to people who've not had the benefit of hearing it before. Lambert, I should explain, is a fascinating figure. He was a distinguished English composer who lived a very short life for a 20th century composer. He died when he was only 45, just about to become 46. He was born in 1905, and his father, George, was an Australian painter, in fact, although he had American connections and other worldly connections. But Lambert spent most of his life in England, was brought up here, educated here. But this is one of the differences about Lambert. So many of the English composers of the early part of the 20th century, they went to Eton and Cambridge or Oxford. They were very much part of the establishment, part of the elite. Lambert was a little different. He was educated at Christ's Hospital in Sussex and then went to the Royal College of Music to study as a pianist and a composer. And many people thought he was an absolute genius, one of the most gifted individuals they've ever come across. And certainly in his early life, he was very, very successful as a composer. He was even asked by Diaghilev to write a ballet for him when he was only 20 years old, when Lambert was only 20 years old. And this was going to be a ballet, which it was, in fact, a ballet based on Romeo and Juliet. And this was, of course, way before Prokofiev's version, which has become much more of the standard repertoire for Romeo and Juliet in the ballet world today. But to have, at the age of 20, a commission from Diaghilev's Ballet Russe to write a full-length ballet was quite something. By the time he was 25, then, Lambert was asked to write this piece. And he dedicated it to Angus Morrison, the pianist who played at the first performance. And it is really quite extraordinary. It's very, very different to the Vaughan Williams that we were looking at last week. No more pentatonic scales and lush English pastoral style with very romantic harmonies and so forth. This is much more, less of an English piece, much more of a world piece. And this very much reflects Lambert's interest in music in general. He was much more interested in what else was going on in the world particularly Africa and America, and African American music was something that fascinated him particularly. The piece has, as I said, is described as a secular cantata, and it's a setting of a poem by Samuel. It's a setting of a piece by Samuel Sitwell, who was the brother of Osbert Sitwell and Edith Sitwell, and it's an extraordinary evocation of life in a rather idealized, rather romanticized Brazil in Southern America. So it's warm and it's sultry and there's dancing and it's all very sort of romanticized. So there's a kind of haze, and it's all concerning a mythical river, namely the Rio Grande. There's no such river in Brazil itself, but this is a kind of fantasy world that appealed both to Sitwell and to Constant Lambert. And sure enough, stylistically, rather than being centered around pentatonic scales and the kind of English pastoral tradition that we're so familiar with, this is much more jazzy. It has been described as a cross between sort of Duke Ellington and English choral music combined. So it's very much a classical piece. Every note is notated. There's no improvisation here. So it's not actually jazz, but it does have jazzy elements, but in particular syncopated rhythms and jazzy harmonies, very chromatic harmonies and so on. So it's a very, very different style from the Vaughan Williams that we were looking at last week. And one of the things that Lambert does with this piece, he has a solo voice, in this case it's a mezzo-soprano, and a choir, but he also has a phenomenally difficult, I should say, piano part. So it is effectively, it's a choral cantata, plus it's a piano concerto combined all at the same time. So the solo pianist is really the star of the show and plays pretty much throughout the work. And it's also scored for strings, large brass section, and a massive percussion section. So there are no woodwind, just brass, strings, and percussion together with the solo piano. And it's the piano that really dominates the piece right from the start. It's a genuine virtuoso play, and it's a fabulous part. The piece itself lasts about 15 minutes. And if you want to check it out after this, I have looked for versions on YouTube. I can't find a decent version that's actually where you can see the performers playing. There are some versions there, but they're not very good in my view. But there's some fabulous recordings which are readily available on YouTube. There's an old Andre Previn one from, I think, 1974, which is brilliant, and that's the one I grew up with. I love that one, but there's some more recent recordings as well. So it's very easy to come by. As I say, it lasts about 15 minutes, and it's an absolute joy. I hope you'll find. The piece itself is structured in an interesting way. So often with pieces of this sort, you tend to get some unusual tonalities. That is the relationship of the keys. And sure enough, in this piece, although it kind of starts in A minor stroke C major, it very soon moves away, and it tends to be moving up all the time. So after C major, it goes into D major, and by the end, we've gone all the way up to E major, which is where it ends. So there's very much this feeling of the tonality going up, expanding, getting higher throughout the piece. And it also has a huge range of musical style and moods. Some of it is distinctly jazzy, as I said, brisk, very lively tempos. It has a phenomenal piano cadenza right in the middle of the piece, which unusually, as well as being very precisely notated, every note is notated. There's no improvisation. But the pianist is accompanied throughout the cadenza by the percussion section. So it's a real tour de force of piano and percussion working together. And then that leads into a much gentler, softer element to the piece, which is some people have described as a nocturne. and it is absolutely stunning. I'll give you a little bit of an idea of how the music sounds in a moment. And then towards the end, the two ideas are repeated. So you get the very lively, jazzy element, and then a much calmer, very subdued ending to the work. If I could just give you a very brief look at some of the material. The piece begins with strings and the piano, and they have this very lively rhythmic. This is all the choir singing out the company. So, by the Rio Grande, they dance no saraband on level banks like lawns above the glassy, lolling tide. And you'll hear lots of this kind of material played by the piano. That kind of thing features a great deal in the piano writing. Then, as I say, you have this very long extended cadenza, which is just phenomenal with the percussion. And that then slows down and we lead into this very subdued section. But the poem has the text, the noisy streets are empty and hushed is the town. To where in the square they dance and the band is playing. And this is the material. The noisy streets. So you get a sense there of just how the feel of this music has this really beautiful, lilting, slightly jazzy, but very, very subtle approach to this extraordinary text. I think maybe when you hear it, you may think it reminds you of George Gershwin and Rhapsody in Blue. And in some respects, that's hardly surprising. Rhapsody in Blue was written just a few years before this piece. So it's quite likely that Lambert would have heard Rhapsody and been influenced by it. And of course, that was where perhaps the idea of the piano concerto came in. But of course, the major difference is this has a text, and this has choir, and this has a vocal soloist as well. So it's kind of moving on from where Gershwin left off in Rhapsody in Blue. I said that Lambert was an interesting character. And this is certainly true. He was always inclined to have troubles with alcohol and indulgences of various kinds. He also had quite a severe health issue. He suffered from septicemia when he was quite young, and he had a horrible mistrust of medics and doctors in particular. So that kind of produced a feeling of demons within his life, which never quite went away. He also had a piece called Last Testaments of Summer, which was not particularly well received. And thereafter, he didn't write very much. So in the second half of his life, and when he got to his 30s and early 40s, there were comparatively few pieces that he wrote. He rather lost his confidence as a composer, which was a real shame. However, the one thing he did do was become a very successful writer and in particular a conductor. and he was actually appointed in 1931 to be the musical director and conductor of the Vic Wells Ballet Company, which of course is what went on to become the Royal Ballet as we know it. And Dame Nanette de Valois, for instance, described him as the greatest ballet conductor she'd ever seen. And he had a phenomenally successful time at the helm of what became the Royal Ballet Company. And rather surprisingly, or perhaps not, while he was there, he had very much an on and off affair with no less a person than Dame Margot Fonteyn. And she was actually devastated that when she realized that he wasn't going to marry her, and had quite a major impact on her. He also managed to fit in 2 wives and several children, all before dying of pneumonia and diabetes, which hadn't been diagnosed, as I said, at the age of 45. So very young, and a great loss of a wonderful musician. I said he was also a great writer, and one of the things he did was to write a book called Music Ho, which was a kind of reflection on where he felt music had got to in the 1930s. And this has become one of the most read of works of its time. It's a fascinating read. It's also very witty, but it's not very polite about some of his colleagues. I can only say that. So, as I said, do have a listen. If you're not familiar with the Rio Grande, or you haven't heard it for a long time, do have a listen. It's a fabulous piece. I think it's absolutely glorious, and it's a really uplifting, lively but beautiful piece, and just perfect to listen to for 15 minutes of an evening. I said earlier that I was going to do 2 things today, so I'm going to move on to the second idea that I was wanted to speak to you about. And this occurred to me just the other day, mainly because I'm sure you've been aware of the wonderful 100th birthday of Captain Tom, or Colonel, whatever he is now. And also yesterday was my younger daughter's birthday. So there have been lots of performances of that famous tune, which people say is perhaps the most performed tune in the world. And I can very much believe it. However, it's a tune which I'm sure, along with yourselves, I find slightly annoying at various times, partly because of the way the words go with the music, or perhaps don't go with the music. Let me just give you a very quick example. So, if you're playing the normal Happy Birthday to, in other words, all the emphasis of the melody is on the word to, rather than where it should be or needs to be on the word you. So, birthday to, and then it does again. Happy birthday to you. So we get that far. Then we have this unfortunate interval. Happy birthday. The famous octave, which most people never make. And you hear performance after performance of this piece where people never get the whole octave. Happy birthday, or something even worse. And it just doesn't work. So what I'm suggesting is that what we should do with this melody is to slightly modify it. So what I've done is to start here. Happy birthday to you. So we go up on the word you. Happy birthday to you. So the important person is what happens at the top of the phrase. And instead of having that awkward octave, happy birthday, dear Captain Tom. Happy birthday to you. There is my uprated version of Happy Birthday. And if it happens to be anybody's birthdays around now, may I wish you a very happy birthday indeed. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this has been at least visible to you all. I hope the technology has worked and that you can actually see what I'm doing, or vaguely. And I shall look forward to hearing your comments and talking to you again next week. Thank you very much. Bye for now.